Hello, this is Dr. Grande. Today's question is, can I analyze the case of Dorothy Stratten? Just a reminder, I'm not diagnosing you by this video, only speculating about what could be happening in a situation like this. If you enjoyed this video, please like it, subscribe to my channel, and consider supporting me on Patreon. I will put the link to Patreon in the description for this video. First, I'll look at the background of this case. I'll move to the timeline of the crime, then offer my analysis. Dorothy Ruth Stratten was born in Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada, on February 28, 1960. Later, she would go by the name Dorothy Stratten. Her father, Simon, and her mother, Nellie, were originally from the Netherlands. Dorothy had a younger brother and a younger sister. She did not really know her father. She was raised by her mother. In 1977, Dorothy met a man named Paul Snyder at a Dairy Queen where she worked part-time as she was in high school. Paul Snyder was born in 1951. He was 9 years older than Dorothy. He worked as a business manager for sex workers and a club promoter. Dorothy and Paul became romantically involved. Paul took Dorothy to her high school prom. In 1978, he sent photographs of Dorothy to Playboy magazine. The images were clothing challenged. The magazine was interested in Dorothy, and she moved to Los Angeles in August of that same year. Paul was not far behind her. He moved out in October. Dorothy started using the name Dorothy Stratten at this time and had good success with Playboy magazine. In June of 1979, Dorothy and Paul married over the objection of many of her friends, as well as Hugh Hefner, who of course ran Playboy magazine. Hefner really liked Dorothy Stratten, but he was not a big fan of Paul Snyder, believing him to be a hustler. I find it interesting that Hefner selected this particular term, as that is the title of a competing magazine during that same time. Other people also warned Dorothy about her husband, pointing out how he was not an ideal mate for her. People viewed Paul as inferior and out of place in Hollywood. Dorothy was destined to be a star, and Paul could only hold her back. Dorothy became Miss August 1979 and was given a job at the Playboy Club in Los Angeles. Her job was Playboy Bunny. Dorothy was able to get into acting with the help of Hugh Hefner. In 1979, she landed small roles in the television series Fantasy Island and Buck Rogers in the 25th Century. She started to land more roles on television and in the movies. During this time, Paul was functioning as Dorothy's acting coach and driver. He was also temporarily her manager. Dorothy started having an affair with a director named Peter Bogdanovich after meeting him at a roller disco party in October of 1979. Peter cast Dorothy in a movie he was working on titled They All Laughed, which was shooting in New York City. Paul wanted to travel with Dorothy to New York, but she convinced him to stay in Los Angeles by telling him that the movie set was restricted to cast and crew only. In March of 1980, Dorothy traveled to New York to start working on the movie. Dorothy and Peter had sex for the first time the next day. In April of 1980, Dorothy returned to Los Angeles in order to complete a few projects related to Playboy magazine, as Peter remained in New York City to work on the film. The movie was months from being completed. On April 30, Dorothy attended a luncheon at Hugh Hefner's mansion and was presented to the media as the 1980 Playmate of the Year. That evening, Dorothy was a guest on The Tonight Show, starring Johnny Carson. On May 1, Dorothy started a promotional tour of Canada. Nothing was scheduled on her first weekend, so she visited Peter in New York. When Dorothy returned to Canada, she wrote Paul a letter requesting more freedom in their marriage. When Paul read the letter, he became extremely angry. Dorothy's tour of Canada concluded in Vancouver. She was scheduled to have a few days off so she could spend time with family. Paul traveled to Vancouver and interrupted this time. He convinced Dorothy to make appearances at a few nightclubs. He collected all the appearance fees and kept the money for himself. The couple did not get along in Vancouver. They ended up having a terrible argument. Dorothy presented the idea of abandoning her acting career and returning to Vancouver. She and Paul could be together just as they were in the beginning. Paul did not accept this option. He returned to Los Angeles as Dorothy traveled to New York City to continue filming with Peter. Dorothy started avoiding Paul's phone calls. She sent him another letter declaring that they were now physically and financially separated. Paul took all the money the couple had out of a joint bank account. He sold some of Dorothy's property. He had an affair, and he hired a private detective. He now believed Dorothy was having an affair with Peter. In July of 1980, when the production in New York City was complete, Dorothy and Peter traveled to England for 10 days. When they were done, Dorothy moved into Peter's mansion in Los Angeles. Now moving to the timeline of the crime. Paul Snider borrowed a .38 caliber revolver from an acquaintance and drove to Peter's mansion on the night of July 31, 1980. It was his intent to kill anyone he saw entering or exiting the property. After about 2 hours, he became impatient and left. On August 8, Dorothy and Paul met at his residence in Los Angeles. Paul tried to convince Dorothy to take him back, but she told him that she was in love with Peter. She made it clear to Paul that their relationship was over. The couple agreed to meet in a week to work out a financial agreement. Later that same day, Paul returned the revolver to its owner. On August 9, Paul and the private detective he had hired traveled to a local gun store. Paul learned that he could not buy a gun because of his Canadian citizenship. He asked the private detective to buy the gun for him, but he wouldn't do it. 4 days later, Paul was able to secure a weapon from a private seller. It was a 12-gauge pump-action shotgun. He explained to friends how he bought it in order to take up hunting. On August 14, 1980, Dorothy met with her business manager to prepare for her meeting with Paul that same day. This was the meeting where they would iron out the money situation. Dorothy's business manager told her to let the lawyers handle the divorce, but Dorothy said that the process would go smoother if she was personally involved, and she wanted to remain Paul's friend. Dorothy was carrying $1,100 in cash when she arrived at Paul's residence in Los Angeles at 11:45 a.m. This was supposed to be a down payment on their settlement. Paul had 2 roommates who left in the morning, so Dorothy and Paul were alone. Within an hour of Dorothy's arrival, Paul shot her once in the face with his shotgun, killing her. About an hour later, he turned the weapon on himself. When the roommates returned, they noticed that Dorothy's vehicle was parked out front and the door to Paul's bedroom was closed. They figured that the couple had worked out their differences and were in the bedroom. The roommates spent several hours in the living room watching TV. Just after 11 p.m., they entered Paul's bedroom to see what was going on. They would find the nude bodies of Dorothy and Paul. Reportedly, Hugh Hefner and Peter Bogdanovich were both devastated by the news of Dorothy's murder. Hugh Hefner died about 37 years later on September 27, 2017, at the age of 91. Peter Bogdanovich died on January 6, 2022, at the age of 82. Now moving to my analysis. Dorothy Stratten was described as naive, shy, romantic, and sensitive. She had been abandoned by her father, which may have contributed to her tendency to seek the approval of men. She had an impressive work ethic. She started working for Dairy Queen at the age of 14. It appears as though Dorothy did not fully appreciate that she was attractive or that she could be successful. Paul was the first man to tell her this, and it had a profound impact on her. He pressured her into taking the photographs, which led her to being recognized by Playboy magazine. As Dorothy became increasingly successful as an actress and model, Paul's initial contribution of discovering her potential became less important. Everyone who knew Dorothy despised Paul. They viewed him as a creepy, small-time loser who was invited to the big time only because of Dorothy's beauty. Paul was out of place, awkward, insecure, and did not possess the skills needed for success in Hollywood. To Dorothy's friends, Paul was simply an unsightly appendage who needed to be eliminated, yet Dorothy kept him around. As time went on, Paul became aware that he was being replaced as Dorothy's romantic interest and, consequently, pushed out of Hollywood. Hugh Hefner had banned him from the Playboy Mansion, and Peter Bogdanovich was having an affair with his wife. As a Canadian citizen, Paul was not allowed to work in the United States. He was dependent on Dorothy for money. Taking cash out of their joint bank account and selling Dorothy's property held him over for a while, but he wanted more. From Paul's point of view, he was losing everything. The world that Paul had introduced Dorothy to had stolen her from him and rejected him as unwanted. Rather than leaving in disgrace and letting his enemies be victorious, Paul decided to get his revenge against Dorothy Stratten, Hugh Hefner, and Peter Bogdanovich. The way the story typically gets framed is that Paul was some type of low-life criminal who was trying to hang on to Dorothy as she gravitated toward men who were trying to help her. The reality is that everybody in the story was trying to get something from Dorothy. It's not clear that anybody was really looking out for her. Like nobody really seemed to have her best interest in mind. The two other main players in the story, Hugh Hefner and Peter Bogdanovich, may not have been small-time like Paul Snider, but that doesn't mean they were positive influences with pure motives. In a sense, one could argue that they were simply different versions of Paul Snider, who also wanted to control Dorothy Stratten. First, I'll take a look at Peter Bogdanovich, then move to Hugh Hefner. Peter offered Dorothy a part in the 1981 movie, They All Laughed. Peter had written the screenplay for the movie, and it's clear that the characters in the movie were based on Peter's own awkward sense of romance. He was trying to express his fantasy with Dorothy through the characters. It was a terrible movie. Instead of They All Laughed, it should have been titled They All Decided to Stay Home instead of buying a movie ticket. The movie was a major flop. Peter had directed successful movies in the past, for example, The Last Picture Show, starring Sybil Shepherd. Peter and Sybil started having an affair when she was working on that movie. Peter left his wife and kids for Sybil. The couple stayed together until 1978. After losing Sybil, Peter was looking for a replacement. This is when he found Dorothy. It would appear that Peter was fascinated by and fixated on a certain look, attractiveness level, and age group. Peter looked down on Paul Snider as an unworthy husband for Dorothy. Peter believed that he was entitled to have her. He deserved her because he was a director. Peter inserted himself into their marriage. After losing Dorothy due to Homicide, Peter attempted to resurrect the movie They All Laughed by dumping $5 million into promoting it. Predictably, his efforts failed, and he went bankrupt. Peter married Dorothy's 20-year-old sister, Louise, in 1988. They divorced in 2001. Once again, we see Peter gravitating toward a certain image. Now moving to Hugh Hefner. Peter would later claim that Hugh Hefner pursued Dorothy as a sexual partner. There was a rumor that she may have married Paul in order to prevent Hefner from making advances, so Paul was around to protect her. Of these three men, Hefner made the most money from Dorothy's work. He was financially successful even without her, but Hefner always wanted to be more than he was, which is a theme with these three men. Hefner wanted to be accepted by the Hollywood elites and not simply be just a person who started a magazine that took advantage of women. In one sense, Hefner probably realized that he and Paul were very much alike, just at different levels of wealth and popularity. Hefner tried to get Paul out of the way by banning him from the mansion. All three men in this narrative were flawed and immature characters who were missing something from their lives. All three men wanted to be more than they were. All three viewed Dorothy as someone who could meet their needs, who could help them ascend to the next level. Driven by their own selfish motives and limited by a pronounced lack of empathy, they did not recognize the dangerous capabilities of each other. Peter and Hugh Hefner could not empathize with Paul. Therefore, they could not predict his behavior. They failed to protect Dorothy. Now moving to my final thoughts. When a person tries to control another person, the result is undesirable. When multiple people driven by narcissism and fueled by immaturity compete with each other to control another person, the result is disastrous. Those are my thoughts in the case of Dorothy Stratten. Please put any opinions and thoughts in the comments section. They always generate an interesting dialogue. As always, I hope you found my analysis of this topic to be informative. Thanks for watching.